January 1945, somewhere on the frozen Western Front. A thin mist clings to the blackened ruins of a French village. The wind moves through the broken windows like a whisper of ghosts. German infantry huddle in the rubble, cold, tired, half-starved. Their rifles lie across bricks dusted with frost. At the edge of the ruined street, a young gunner crouches behind a shattered wall. His rifle looks wrong. The barrel is worn, the wood chipped, and atop it, a crude, hand-fitted scope, held in place by bits of wire and scavenged metal. The men behind him snicker. "Homemade optics," one mutters. He couldn't hit a cow in a barn, but the gunner says nothing. He squints through the rough lens, breath steadying. Across the distant field, more than 1,000 yards away, faint figures move. American soldiers advancing through the fog. He adjusts his improvised sight, calculates wind, distance, drop, all in silence. Then, slowly, he exhales. The crack of the rifle cuts through the cold morning air. Moments later, the laughter stops, because against all reason, the shot had found its mark. By January 1945, the German army was fighting on fumes. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht had been pushed back across every front, from the shattered cities of the East to the crumbling defenses of the West. Supply lines were broken. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was rationed. And the once mighty German war machine, and famed for its precision engineering, was now surviving on improvisation and desperation. Factories in Berlin, Dresden, and Essen had been flattened by Allied bombers. The optical workshops of Carl Zeiss and Hensoldt, once the pride of German craftsmanship, lay in ruins or were scattered to underground facilities. Skilled machinists were drafted into combat. Glass supplies ran out. What few scopes could still be made were hoarded for elite SS marksmen or armored units. For the ordinary soldier on the front, there was nothing left but what they could scavenge, steal, or build with their own hands. In this harsh twilight of the war, German troops became masters of field modification. Rifles with worn-out barrels were rebored. Broken MG-42 tripods were welded back together using tank scrap, and some, like our unnamed gunner, tried to create what the Army could no longer supply: a functional rifle scope. It wasn't uncommon. Across both fronts, there are scattered accounts of soldiers soldering old binocular lenses onto rifle mounts, using brass tubing or even tin from ration cans as crude housings. The optics were unstable, the magnification low, and alignment nearly impossible. Yet in the hands of a patient marksman, even such a tool could extend life or end it. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the U.S. Army was advancing relentlessly through Belgium and northern France. After the failed German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, American forces were moving fast toward the Rhine. German units, cut off and under strength, were forced into desperate rearguard actions. Snipers, or Scharfschützen, as the Germans called them, played an outsized role in slowing that advance. They were few in number, but terrifyingly effective, often holding up entire companies for hours. Still, by 1945, even these specialists were running out of proper equipment. The famed ZF-39 and ZF-41 sniper scopes were becoming rare treasures. So when one gunner in a shattered platoon turned up with a self-made optic clamped to his carabiner 98K, his comrades couldn't help but laugh. To them, it looked ridiculous, a desperate trick by a man refusing to accept defeat. But in truth, it was a glimpse of the old German engineering spirit, surviving in the hands of one soldier amid the wreckage of a dying Reich. And out in the snow, across from their ruined position, the Americans were closing in, confident, well-supplied, and unaware that one of history's most improbable long-range shots was about to be taken. To understand what that shot meant, and why it seemed impossible we need to understand the world of WIT optics and the soldiers who used them. German precision optics had once been the envy of the world. Long before the war, companies like Carl Zeiss, Hensoldt, and Voigtländer had pioneered rifle scopes that were decades ahead of their time. The ZF-39, a Fourier scope fitted to the Karabiner 98K, could reliably hit man-sized targets at 800 meters in the hands of a trained sniper. Its clarity, light transmission, and mechanical stability were unmatched, but that was 1941. By 1945, nearly every advantage had been bombed, burned, or captured. The trained snipers who had studied wind drift, range estimation, and target movement were either dead, captured, or reassigned to frontline defense. The last reserves of scopes were mounted on rifles for propaganda photos, not combat. The result was a collapse in standardization. One unit might have a mix of scopes, ZF-39, ZF-41, and even civilian hunting optics stripped from private collections and hastily reissued by desperate quartermasters. Many of these had fogged lenses, cracked reticles, or unreliable zeroing. The magnification varied wildly, and some improvised mounts caused the scope to shift with every shot. Yet amid this breakdown, there were men who refused to surrender to poor tools. They adjusted, innovated, and built, using the skills of a dying industrial empire to keep fighting. For context, let's look at the limits of technology. A 1-200-yard shot, roughly 1 in 100 meters, pushes the 7.92 250-centimeter Mauser cartridge far beyond its ideal performance. Even with perfect optics, that distance would demand exceptional conditions: minimal wind, stable rest, and precise elevation adjustment. Bullet drop alone could exceed 15 feet, and any misalignment in the scope could send the round tens of meters off target. To hit such a shot with a homemade scope was not just unlikely, it bordered on the impossible. The Americans, meanwhile, relied on more standardized equipment. The M1903A4 Springfield, with its Weaver 330C scope, was accurate up to 600-800 yards. The newer M1C Garand Sniper variant added semi-automatic firepower but suffered from mounting instability. U.S. snipers, trained to fire at realistic combat ranges, 300 to 600 yards, where reliability mattered, more than sheer distance. That's why Allied records often dismissed German long-range claims as field exaggerations. After all, without proper optics or rangefinders, such distances seemed unprovable. But among Wehrmacht veterans, a handful of documented accounts exist: soldiers who modified civilian telescopes, artillery optics, or even aircraft gun sights into makeshift sniper systems. These were no miracle weapons, they were acts of sheer ingenuity. And in one forgotten platoon, somewhere between the Ardennes and the Rhine, a young German gunner had done just that. He'd taken broken glass, scavenged screws, and metal from a wrecked scope mount, and built something that barely held together. Yet in the bitter quiet of January 1945, that fragile device would make him a legend among his comrades. The human angle, the gunner who refused to give up. He was 24 years old, a veteran by the standards of 1945. No medals, no promotions, just another infantryman whose name never reached a history book. What set him apart wasn't his uniform or his rifle, but the way he refused to let either define his fate. He had once been an apprentice machinist in Leipzig. Working on optical instruments before the war consumed everything. When his factory was converted to produce gun sights for the Luftwaffe, he spent years learning the delicate art of glass alignment, how a single fraction of a degree could turn precision into chaos. Then, as the front lines closed in and Germany's manpower collapsed, he was drafted into the Wehrmacht. By 1945, that knowledge, once used to help others aim, became his only weapon. The men around him had lost faith in everything: command, logistics, even luck. They fought not for victory, but for survival, one ruined village at a time. In that hopeless silence, the young gunner began scavenging. A cracked lens from a destroyed Zeiss binocular, a bent scope tube from an abandoned rifle, and screws from the remnants of an anti-aircraft sight. Piece by piece, he built something of his own. When he first mounted the homemade scope onto his rifle, the others laughed. It looked absurd. A crooked tube, reinforced with wire and bits of melted tin. The lenses fogged when he breathed near them. The crosshair, made from the filament of a flashlight bulb, wasn't even centered. But to him, it wasn't about appearance. It was about control. He spent hours behind that broken wall, adjusting and recalibrating by hand. When others rested, he would sight distant trees, adjust for parallax, test elevation. Every shot, every flicker of movement through that scope was a defiance of the chaos closing in around him. The men began to call him the Tinkerer, some mockingly, others with quiet respect. Because even if his contraption was unstable, there was something admirable, almost defiant, in his persistence. He knew the risks. A scope that shifted under recoil could send a bullet anywhere. One misfire and the fragile glass would shatter. But it didn't stop him. For him, the rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was proof that skill could outlast supply, that human precision could stand against collapse. And as the American patrols began pressing closer each day, better armed, better fed, confident in their advance, the Tinkerer kept watching through his improvised lens, waiting for the one moment when he could prove that a man's will could be sharper than any factory-made machine. The laughter would soon stop. But before that happened, the gunner had to face the limits not just of his scope, but of himself. The technical angle. How a homemade scope defied the odds to anyone who understands the physics of long-range shooting. A 1-200-yard hit with a WR-2T-era rifle borders on impossible. Yet, in theory, under the right hands, it could be done. The German gunner's rifle was almost certainly a Carabiner 98K, chambered for the 7.92 57mm Mauser cartridge. This was a rifle known for its ruggedness and accuracy. Its effective range was about 500 meters for ordinary infantry use, but snipers had pushed it much further. The rifle's iron sights alone were calibrated up to 2,000 meters. Though that was more optimistic than practical, the real limitation wasn't the rifle. It was the optics. The factory-made ZF-39 scope, with its 48x magnification and precise adjustment knobs, gave trained marksmen confidence out to 800-900 meters. A shot beyond 1,000 yards demanded extraordinary knowledge of ballistics, wind, and bullet drop. The Mauser round at that range would lose nearly half its speed, and gravity would pull it downward more than 4 meters. A slight crosswind could drift the bullet by several feet. The gunner's homemade optic lacked the mechanical precision of a Zeiss mount. It had no calibrated turrets, no parallax correction, and likely a fixed zero that shifted with each recoil. His only way to compensate was instinct and repetition. He would have spent days sighting targets at varying ranges, memorizing how the impact shifted with distance. His scope was probably closer to a fixed telescope than a true sniper optic, a repurposed lens assembly salvaged from destroyed binoculars or rangefinders. The lenses would have been ground for observation, not precision aiming, causing distortion at the edges and a narrow field of view. To adjust, he may have added thin metal shims under one side of the mount, a crude but effective way to shift point of impact. In simple terms, every shot required him to relearn his weapon. But this was also where German marksmanship tradition shone. Even at the end of the war, Wehrmacht snipers were trained to read mirage, wind flags, and bullet trace. They practiced Fühlen der Kugel, the feeling of the bullet, a term for instinctive adjustment learned through endless repetition. Skilled gunner could estimate range by the size of an enemy figure through his scope, and correct elevation by subtle changes in cheek weld or holdover. It wasn't science alone, it was intuition shaped by experience. That combination of machine understanding and human feel made the impossible possible. So when that soldier placed his rough, wire-bound scope against the cold steel of his cheek, he wasn't gambling. He was calculating wind speed, distance, temperature, and bullet drop, all in seconds. His weapon might have been improvised, but his knowledge was not. And when he found his target, American soldiers moving across open terrain, he saw not a hopeless shot, but a narrow moment of perfection. That moment would become his legend. The setup. The moment before the shot. The morning was cold enough to bite through wool. The snow had hardened overnight, and every footstep on the frozen ground cracked like splintered glass. The gunner lay prone behind the wall of a half-destroyed farmhouse, his breath ghosting out in faint clouds that drifted over the rifle's barrel. His platoon had been ordered to hold this position, a nameless ridge overlooking a narrow road where American troops were advancing. They were outnumbered, low on ammunition, and nearly out of food. The sound of distant tank engines echoed through the valley, a low, steady growl that reminded them the front was collapsing inch by inch. To most, it was hopeless. To him, it was focus. Through his crude scope, the gunner saw movement far beyond the range of ordinary fire. Tiny figures moving between patches of snow-dusted brush. American infantry, maybe half a kilometer away at first, then a few broke off, advancing along the open slope. Unaware they were visible through the haze. He adjusted the lens slightly, twisting it with fingers stiff from the cold. The glass trembled in its mount, the sight picture warping slightly at the edges. Still, the center was clear enough. He counted the distance. 1,000, 1,100, perhaps 1,200 yards. Too far for certainty. Behind him, the others whispered. Too far. Don't waste the round. But he didn't hear them anymore. His world had narrowed to a single figure in the distance. One man walking in rhythm, rifle slung, confident. He calculated quickly. The angle of the slope, the wind brushing from the left, the drop he'd measured days before using fence posts as markers. The holdover would have to be massive, several feet above the target. He took a slow breath. His pulse steadied. The rifle's worn steel felt alive beneath his glove. Then he began to squeeze the trigger. A fraction of a second before the shot, even the wind seemed to pause. The shot, silence, and then disbelief. The rifle cracked. A single, sharp note that tore through the frozen air and echoed off the stone walls. The recoil jolted through his shoulder, and for an instant the scope blurred with vibration. Then, stillness. Through the shaky lens, the gunner tried to find the figure again. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The Americans continued their slow advance, unaware. Then, one man stumbled. His body twisted unnaturally, momentum carrying him forward before collapsing into the snow. The others dove for cover. A shout rang out, then another. Confusion swept across the patrol line. From behind the ruined wall, the German soldiers froze in disbelief. One whispered, "Mein Gott!" He hit him. No one spoke after that. They watched through binoculars, the crude, battered kind used for spotting, as the Americans pulled their wounded comrade back toward the trees. There was no return fire. The range was too great, the shooter invisible. The gunner exhaled quietly. His hands trembled not from cold, but from realization. He had done what no one believed possible. The scope, his fragile creation of scrap and wire, had held steady. The bullet, traveling over 1,000 yards, had found its mark. He adjusted his sight again, scanning for movement. His comrades, once mockers, now stared at him with a new silence, a mix of awe and unease. In their eyes, he was no longer the tinkerer. He was a marksman, Then came the distant sound. A whistle, a thud, mortar fire. The Americans were retaliating blindly. Shells landing further downslope, shaking the frozen earth. Dust filled the air, stones raining over the wall. The gunner ducked low, clutching his rifle to his chest. When the barrage ceased, the valley was quiet again. The only sound was the faint hum of the wind. He glanced once more through the scope, the lens now cracked at its edge from recoil vibration. Still, through the fractured glass, he saw the same empty slope, and the dark imprint where his bullet had struck. For that moment, brief, fragile, unrecorded, he had proven that skill could triumph over circumstance. But the war wasn't finished with him yet. The reaction, respect in the ruins. For a long time after the shot, no one spoke. The silence wasn't out of fear, but out of reverence, the kind that follows when men witness something that shouldn't have been possible. The gunner sat quietly behind his rifle, watching the snow settle on the barrel. His comrades, who had mocked him hours before, now gathered in cautious awe. One of them, the squad leader, crouched beside him, peered through the cracked scope, and then simply shook his head. "Impossible," he muttered. Word spread fast through the platoon. By nightfall, men from neighboring positions came to see the rifle for themselves. They passed it hand to hand, inspecting the crooked mount, the rough welds, the makeshift screws that held it all together. One soldier laughed softly, not in mockery this time, but in disbelief. They began calling him Der Bastler, the tinkerer, with a new tone of respect. In a war now defined by collapse and retreat, a single impossible hit had become a spark of pride. The platoon commander eventually sent word to battalion headquarters, but by the time the report reached anyone who cared, the front had already shifted miles east. There was no medal, no official confirmation, no mention in the daily orders. It was just another entry in the blur of a dying army's final battles. Still, for the men who saw it, the story stayed alive. Around campfires in abandoned barns, they retold it. How a soldier with a handmade scope had struck an American at 1,200 yards. Each version changed slightly, growing in detail, but the truth remained the same. It had happened. When asked later why he built the scope, the gunner's answer was simple. He told one comrade quietly, "If the factories are gone, we make our own." That line, plain, defiant, became something of a motto for the few still fighting. And as the weeks dragged on, the tinkerer's story traveled farther than he ever did, carried by rumor and respect among soldiers who had little else left to believe in. The wider meaning, ingenuity, amid collapse in the months that followed, the German army continued to disintegrate. Entire divisions evaporated in the Ruhr pocket and along the Elbe. Cities fell faster than orders could be transmitted. What remained of the Wehrmacht was a patchwork of remnants, fragments of once great regiments held together by instinct, pride, and habit. In such chaos, acts like the tinkerers were small, almost invisible. But they spoke volumes about the spirit of a soldier, shaped by a collapsing empire. Across the front, other men improvised in similar ways. Some used parts from aircraft gun sights to fashion crude periscopes. Others repurposed tank optics for sniper rifles. Mechanics built mobile radios from wrecked vehicles. Every scrap of German ingenuity that had once fueled the industrial miracle of the Reich was now being used for survival. But these efforts, however brilliant, could not change the course of the war. By March 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. The Luftwaffe was grounded, and fuel stocks were measured in hours, not days. The gunner's platoon, like thousands of others, was eventually overrun or captured as American and British units pressed eastward. His rifle likely ended up in an Allied collection point, tagged, inspected, and dismissed as a curiosity. To most soldiers who handled it afterward, It was just another relic of desperation. A handmade scope on an obsolete weapon, a strange artifact from the ruins of Hitler's army. No one wrote down the maker's name. No one preserved his story in a report. And yet, the legend of that shot survived, passed through veterans' accounts, retold in barracks, sometimes doubted, sometimes believed. It symbolized something larger than marksmanship. It represented the thin line between defeat and defiance, how one man, armed with skill instead of resources, could make the impossible real, even if only once. Historians today find traces of similar feats in war diaries and letters. Unnamed soldiers recording long-range kills with improvised optics near Cologne, Remagen, and the Harz Mountains. None can be proven, but all share the same spirit. The spirit of a craftsman turned fighter, who, amid the ruins of his nation, refused to let precision die with the factories. And through that one perfect shot, a symbol of ingenuity under collapse, his story endures, even if his name does not. The last shot of ingenuity, when history speaks of the final months of the Second World War, it often tells stories of destruction, cities in flames, armies in retreat, millions displaced. What it rarely tells are the quiet moments of defiance that lived. In the margins, the ingenuity of men who refused to let collapse erase their craft. The German gunners' 1-200-yard shot was not a turning point in the war. It changed nothing on the map, saved no cities, won no battles. Yet it stands as a small, enduring testament to the resilience of human skill. In a time when factories had been reduced to rubble, when precision tools were a memory, one man reminded the world that mastery is not made of machines. It is made of understanding. His homemade scope was not beautiful. It was crude, fragile, and temporary, like the world around him. But within its imperfect glass, he found focus when everything else was falling apart. That, perhaps, is the quiet truth of war. Not just the clash of armies, but the struggle of individuals to keep meaning alive amid chaos. When the Reich fell and the flags changed, his story vanished into the silence of surrender. His rifle was likely melted down, his name lost to paperwork, his scope discarded. But the echo of that single shot, fired through cracked glass across a frozen field, still speaks to something timeless. Because long after the empires that built him crumbled, the lesson remained, even in the darkest winters of history. Ingenuity can survive where order does not. And somewhere, buried beneath the snow and silence of 1945, lies a fragment of glass, once part of a scope that shouldn't have worked, but did.